Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Anne Sullivan's time at Tewksbury Hospital and the Perkins School for the Blind. So tonight we're going to first start with Liz Robinson. Liz is a 5-year volunteer at the Public Health Museum. She's with us to briefly discuss Anne's time at the hospital from 1876 to 1880. And she's also going to share photographs of Anne's intake records and other associated artifacts. So all of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Liz for joining us tonight. And Liz, if you just give me 15 seconds, I'm going to share your slides. So one moment. And let me maximize them. All right, now Liz, I'm going to spotlight your video and I'm going to turn my video off and let me fix the slides. All right. All right, take it away, Liz.
Okay, well, thank you and welcome everyone. Thanks for logging in on what it would have been Anne Sullivan's 156th birthday week. As Robert said, I am a volunteer at the Public Health Museum. It's located in the administration building of what was the Tewksbury State Hospital and Infirmary, and prior to that, the Alms House. So if we could have the first slide. Before Anne Sullivan became well known as Helen Keller's tutor and companion, she was just a little girl. She was born in Western Massachusetts in the Feeding Hill section of Agawam on April 14, 1866, of Irish immigrant parents. When Anne was 8 years old, her mother died from tuberculosis. 2 years later, her father abandoned Anne and her brother Jimmy, sending them to Tewksbury Almshouse. Next slide. Tewksbury Almshouse was built in 1854 to house the poor, but quickly began taking in those with physical and mental illnesses. Annie and Jimmy were admitted on February 22nd, 1876. This is a picture of her intake record. On it, it stated she had sore eyes. This was a result of trachoma, a bacterial eye infection contracted when she was about 5 years old, which severely damaged her eyesight. Jimmy was admitted with a hip complaint, tubercular in nature. Next slide. Annie and Jimmy were housed in the women's ward with physically and mentally ill women. Though males and females were separated, Anne, who was very strong-willed, convinced those in charge to let her brother stay with her in the women's ward. Next slide. Jimmy died 3 months later and is buried in the Tewksbury State Cemetery, also known as the Pine Cemetery. It's a 2.5 to 3 acre plot of land containing over 10,000 burials of unclaimed bodies. His grave, as are all the graves, is marked by a simple cross encased in a laurel wreath. These markers were manufactured by residents of Tewksbury Almshouse in the metal shop. The number on the cross corresponds with a name found in the almshouse ledgers. Records prior to 1891, however, have been lost, so the exact location of Jimmy's burial is unknown. Next slide. At the time of Jimmy's death, Maggie Carroll, a severely disabled resident of the almshouse, who Anne had befriended, told her to resign herself to life at the institution because it was God's will. Annie refused to entertain such a thought and did not consider life at the almshouse to be her future. Next slide. While living at the almshouse, Anne had 2 unsuccessful eye surgeries. The first was in February 1877 at Sisters of Charity Hospital in Lowell, Massachusetts. After the surgery, she remained in the hospital helping the nuns in the wards until July, when she had a second surgery at City Infirmary. Both surgeries failed and did not improve her eyesight. She returned to Tewksbury, where she was now housed with single mothers and unmarried pregnant women. Next slide. Anne wrote of her days at Tewksbury Almshouse in an essay, Foolish Remarks of a Foolish Woman. She said, "The misfortunes of the disinherited of the world rouse in me not only compassion, but a fierce indignation. The almshouse was underfunded and overcrowded. It was noisy, the majority of residents being Irish Catholic working men and women who tended to be very loud and also very emotional." Next slide. As a girl, she never attended school when living in Feeding Hills, yet she very much desired an education. She had learned from a blind resident at Tewksbury of a school for the blind located in Massachusetts. While an investigation of Tewksbury Almshouse was being conducted by the State Board of Charities of Massachusetts in 1880, Anne followed the investigation commission until she mustered the courage to approach Frank Sanborn, an official from the state board. She pleaded, "I want to go to school." Her plea did not fall on deaf ears, and she was discharged from Tewksbury Almshouse to attend Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Massachusetts on October 7th, 1880. It was while at Perkins she had a third eye surgery, which proved to be successful. Next slide. Tewksbury resident sculptor Miko Kaufman immortalized both Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller on the grounds of Tewksbury Town Hall. Unveiled in October 1985, the bronze statue was Miko Kaufman's gift to Tewksbury, recognizing Anne's 4 years at the almshouse and her work as a teacher of the blind. Next. The cemetery and its surroundings make up a portion of the natural landscape of the Tewksbury State Hospital campus, part of Tewksbury's open space collection. Open to the public, the Pine Cemetery Trail takes you past the burial site of residents from both the Tewksbury Almshouse and later the State Hospital, whose bodies were unclaimed. It continues onto the fields of Tewksbury Hospital and affords a few miles of pine grove and woodland walking. And that concludes Anne Sullivan's early years at Tewksbury's Almshouse.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. Really appreciate you taking the time. Let me remove the spotlight and let me start my video. Here we go again. All right. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Jennifer. One moment. Okay, so many people knew about Anne Sullivan's role as Helen Keller's beloved teacher, but not everyone knows that Anne Sullivan was herself visually impaired. From 1880 to 1886, Anne was a student at Perkins School for the Blind. So Jennifer Arnott, who's the research librarian at the Hayes Research Library at Perkins, is going to explain how Anne came to Perkins as a student. Jennifer will also detail Anne's classes, cottage life, reading and learning materials. So again, let's give Jennifer a big virtual round of applause. And Jennifer, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Hello, let me just get the slideshow up as always. There we go.
Great.
So I want to talk about 3 parts of Anne's experience at Perkins. I want to talk about her visual impairment a little bit and what that meant in terms of her education. I'm going to touch on some of what Liz has already talked about Anne getting to go to school. And of the 3 women who are famously associated with Perkins, Laura Bridgman and Helen Keller being the other 2, I always come back to stories about Anne's self-advocacy, and I'm going to tell you one of those that I particularly love. Before we get into Anne's experience at Perkins, I want to give you a brief history of how Perkins was in the 1870s, how we got there. The first person we always want to talk about is John Dix Fisher, who was a doctor. He's seen here as a younger man with dark red hair, gold rimmed glasses, a high collar and cravat. When he finished medical school at Brown University in the late 1820s, he went on a tour of Europe, like people did at that point. and visited schools for the blind. At that point, the US had no schools for the blind at all, and he came back to Boston thinking we should have one. Throughout his life, he was also instrumental in bringing a number of other medical advances to Boston and the US. He contributed to the understanding of smallpox and other diseases, and he helped found the Massachusetts General Hospital. So he had a habit of this. The school was chartered by the legislature in 1829, but then they had to find someone to run it. The story goes that Fisher ran into a Brown Medical School classmate on Newbury Street in South Boston. Samuel Gridley Howe had spent several years fighting, providing medical care to the Greek Revolution, and he'd recently come back to Boston where he'd grown up. Howe never met a challenge he didn't want to take on, and so he agreed to be the first director. He spent 1831 traveling in Europe to see schools there, and when the school opened in September 1832, it was in the front parlor of his parents' house in South Boston with 6 students. Howe had wide-ranging interests and very progressive goals. Besides his work in the Greek Revolution, he was one of the Secret Six who backed John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. He was an ardent abolitionist along with his wife, Julia Ward Howe. She is best known for writing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, but she was also an essayist, poet, and suffragist. Along with his work at Perkins, Howe also did research on and was the first director of a school for children who were intellectually disabled. And he has some notes that have some of the early descriptions and sort of a scientific record of what we now describe as autistic behaviors. Howe was our director until his death in 1876. This portrait of him comes from the mid-1800s, where he's leaning on a chair with his other hand tucked into his jacket. The school quickly outgrew his front parlor, and so in 1833, it moved into a mansion on Pearl Street in South Boston, owned by Thomas Handyside Perkins. By 1837, we had 60 students. The school put a big emphasis on not just academics, but music and physical activity. Music was in large part because it was one of the very few skilled, well-paid trades that somebody who was blind could succeed in, either as sort of a town music teacher or as a church organist. The emphasis on physical activity was for the health of the students and seeking to make them as independent as possible in all areas of their life. It included daily walks, swimming and rowing in Boston Harbor, and calisthenics, as well as a focus on fresh air and good food. I'm going to come back and talk about what the South Boston campus was like when we talk about Anne's time at Perkins, but between 1837 and 1912, when the school moved to the current location in Watertown, the school took over about 2 blocks near the harbor. The central building of the school was this former hotel. You can see that it's a 5-story building with a wraparound porch, covered entryway, and a lot of small bushes and trees. I mentioned Laura Bridgman briefly, but I need to mention her here for several reasons. Perkins has long been associated with deafblind education, but it began 50 years before Helen Keller, and very few people now know about Laura Bridgman. She was born to a small farming family near Dartmouth, New Hampshire in 1829. She caught scarlet fever when she was 2, and when she recovered, she had lost all sense of sight, sound, and smell. A census project in 1837 brought her to Howe's attention, and he brought her to Perkins. Remember that part about never met a challenge he didn't like? At the time, no one who was deafblind had ever had anything like a formal education. We have a number of examples of people who used home signs or family gestures to indicate mostly concrete needs like food or drink or illness, but these didn't generally extend to any more abstract thoughts. So through a very thorough and time-demanding process, Howe set out Laura's education, and a series of female teachers worked closely with her, because this is a very hands-on activity, to help her learn to associate words first with objects and then with concepts or ideas. Laura on the right in this daguerreotype can be seen signing into the hand of her teacher, Sarah Wright. Both the women are wearing typical 1850s dresses, and Laura has a fabric sash over her eyes. Laura went on to complete the same high school education typical of any other student of the time, including history, geography, literature, and natural sciences. She wrote thousands of letters, kept a journal and a dream diary, and she loved talking to anyone she could using tactile sign language. She spent her adult life as a sewing teacher and seamstress. And so I can't say that without showing you a little bit of her work. On the right is an example of her lace work, which was sold as a souvenir during open days at Perkins. And the card notes that Laura also threaded the needle using her tongue. That was typical for blind women who were sewing. The doll on the left is in a red fur trimmed coat, is very similar to one that she made for Anne Sullivan to take to Alabama when she took up her position with the Kellers. So you might guess from me saying that they knew each other. I'll come back to that in a minute. The last person I want to introduce you to is Michael Anagnos, who was born Michael Anagnostophilus on November 7th, 1837 in Papingo, a small village in the mountains of Greece, sometimes also Albania. His father was a farmer and shepherd, but he felt strongly about educating his son. And so Anagnos, as he's known in the US, went on to high school and then university in Athens. He became fluent in Greek, Latin, French, and later English. He studied law and then became a journalist and later editor-in-chief of a daily Athens newspaper. He also, and this is why he ends up in the US, became very active in Greece's fight for independence from the Ottoman Empire. When Howe traveled back to Greece in the late 1860s, he hired Anagnos as his secretary, and Anagnos focused on coordinating relief for the war effort. When Howe came back to Boston, he invited Anagnos to join him, and Anagnos arrived in Boston in 1868. He was 31 at that point, and he started out by becoming a tutor to the Howe family, as well as teaching Greek and Latin to several children at Perkins. As a side note, he also wins our Personal Archives Prize for having the most gorgeous handwriting by far in every language we've seen from him. His Greek is particularly beautiful. He went on to teach Greek at different colleges, and in 1870, he married the Howe's eldest daughter, Julia Romano Howe. At that point, he became Howe's assistant and focused much of his time and attention on Perkins School for the Blind. And at Howe's death in 1876, he became our second director. You can see him in this photo here with several of his teachers. And while Anne Sullivan was a student in the 1880s, he was actively developing and building support to open the first kindergarten for the blind in the United States, which opened in Jamaica Plain in 1886. So now we get to Anne and her leaving Tewksbury. Liz has already given us a really great overview. So just a reminder, she was born in 1866. She becomes blind due to trachoma. She arrives at the Tewksbury Almshouse in 1874. She has 2 unsuccessful eye operations in 1877. And then there's this committee visit to the almshouse, probably in the spring of 1880. The date is a little wobbly there. Before I get into the what else happens here, I do want to talk about one of our main sources. Nella Brady-Henny was an editor, author, and longtime friend of both Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller. And her book, Anne Sullivan Macy, The Story Behind Helen Keller, was published in 1933, based on conversations with and notes from Anne, correspondence with a whole bunch of people who knew both Anne and Helen, additional research, and 15 boxes of her notes and correspondence are in the Perkins archives. The files are digitized, but our archivists are doing additional work for transcription of the letters, especially from Polly Thompson, Helen Keller's other longtime companion and assistant. Polly's handwriting is tremendously hard to read, and so we have 2 longtime volunteers who have cracked the code on how to decipher her handwriting and have made transcriptions, but getting them up and figuring out which ones are actually useful and important and sort of should get priority is also a project, because a lot of them are just about what the garden is doing today and how the dogs are, which great letters, but not as historically relevant as some other pieces. So those are work in progress. So Liz also mentioned that there was a visit by the Board of State Charities in Massachusetts. This visit was actually one of the last things Howe did before his death in 1876. He was the chair at the time. There had been reports of the Tewksbury Almshouse having really poor conditions. They were horribly overcrowded, underfunded. There were some horrific rumors that were not true, but that were also circulating. And so in 1880, there's this visit by the committee chaired by Frank Sanborn, who was a progressive reformer and longtime friend of the Howe family, also one of the Secret Six. Basically in this period in Boston history, everybody knows everybody else, just as I have discovered the longer I work at Perkins. And so he had this tremendous knowledge of Perkins and the school. And so he comes to the almshouse for an inspection. The story, as Anne tells Nella, is that the women at Tewksbury encouraged Anne to approach him. And she says she hurled herself into their midst without knowing which was he, crying, Mr. Sanborn, I want to go to school. And according to Anne's account to Nella, he asked her how long she'd been there, a little bit about herself. And then 1880, in October, she packs up and comes to Perkins. So what does Perkins look like in the 1880s? Just in examples of pure numbers and demographics, there were between 137 to 158 students each year while Anne was there. There are also about 20 adults working in a work department making handcraft items, mattresses, chair caning, some other objects, kept separate from the students, but considered part of the institution. Most of the students were from well-off Protestant families, and Perkins basically focused on students they thought could benefit from an academic education, students who were visually impaired, but who were intellectually able enough to go into an academic field. Students came from Massachusetts, New England, Connecticut had a school for the blind by this point, but nowhere else in New England did. So we have always been the main school for the blind in New England. And occasionally you get students from elsewhere. As I mentioned, Perkins spent much of the early history of the school in South Boston, adding Jamaica Plain with a kindergarten in 1886. Was centered around this former hotel, but the school quickly needed more and more space than the hotel allowed. By Anne's time here, the boys were still housed in the hotel, but the girls lived separately. And the main hotel also had a number of classroom buildings, spaces. So Anne lived in one of the cottages, an innovation that Perkins put in place early in the school's history. On average, these housed 22 people, about 16 girls, one house mother, 3 to 4 teachers, and a cook. The girls slept 2 to a room. Everyone in the cottage shared the household chores. This was done so that girls would be able to be fully part of family life, both during vacations and as adults. The school wanted to do this for the boys, but didn't have the space to do it until we moved to Watertown. Our students still live in cottages. Our student population has changed a lot, so what the chores look like has also changed. But the goal is to encourage them in as many independent living skills as possible. To give you a sense of what the rooms look like, this photo is from 1890. It's a little bit later than Anne's time, but it shows Willie Elizabeth Robin, a deafblind student, and her teacher in their room in their cottage. Willie is sitting in a chair reading an embossed book next to a large framed portrait of herself, and Miss Thayer, her teacher, is sitting in a chair at the desk, turning around to look at her. I want to point out here the large windows for both light and for ventilation. There was this whole process of airing the rooms out during the day so that there would be good, clean air circulating. Tuberculosis was a significant concern in institutions of the time. And it is right around this point that people figure out that it's a bacterium and not something else, and not moral failures or something else that couldn't be treated with medicine. So the windows were this huge process and very important. What did Anne take is the next question. This list comes from the 1878 annual report and includes reading in various ways characters. I'll come back to those in a second. Spelling, writing in square hand. Again, I'll show you some examples. And Braille's point system, geography, civil and physical, arithmetic, mental and with typeboards, algebra, geometry, history, ancient, medieval, and modern, especially the United States, grammar, rhetoric, and composition, English language and literature, civil government, natural history, physics, anatomy and physiology, mental philosophy, and Latin. And sometimes also other languages. Greek was taught occasionally, French was taught occasionally. That's a lot, if you look at that list. It was pretty typical of the high schools of the day, but it was a lot. So I want to talk a little bit about methods of reading and writing, because both because they're very interesting and because it's very different in some ways from what we do now. There are a number of forms of embossed text where the letter is raised from the back of the page in existence. And the one mostly used at Perkins was developed by Samuel Gridley Howe and Stephen P. Ruggles for Perkins in the 1830s. The original versions from France have a very ornate, what we'd call a font. There are lots of curlicues, excuse me. But Boston line type was designed to be easier to read. The angles are sort of more distinct. There are a couple of problems with this, though. The advantage is that a book in embossed type can be read by somebody who reads print. They don't have to learn a new way of reading. But the books are physically quite large. They're very sizable large folio-sized books. It turns out to be very hard to read text this way with your fingers. Every time we hand this to somebody who's comfortable in Braille, they make the most amazing faces about how horrible this is. And the biggest one is that they were both expensive to produce, so there's a limited number of titles available. Anne mentions there being 61. I don't quite trust her count on it, I will say, when she was a student, but there are not a lot. People have to put things into embossed type. And the biggest one is that people who are blind couldn't produce their own embossed text. So they couldn't write notes to themselves that they could read, and they couldn't write notes to their friends who were blind, which I think is a problem. Most people would probably agree. Squarehand was a method that allowed people who were blind to write in pencil using slate with guides to keep their position on the page. Here's a letter from Helen Keller to Michael and Agnes in 1889 when Helen was 8, using square hand. So this is about a year after she learned language. I have met many 8-year-olds with far worse handwriting, including me at that age. My handwriting was awful. It works very well as a method of writing. And if you look at Laura Bridgman's journals, this is also the method that she uses. However, then we get to Braille. Many people immediately think about Braille when they think about blindness. The original book by Louis Braille was published in 1829, but Braille, for a variety of reasons, was not used extensively in schools for the blind until the 1880s. Braille isn't a language of itself, it's a way of coding other languages. So here you can see the alphabet from Louis Braille's original system. This is his original book. We are very lucky to have a copy. And it also shows the cells for punctuation. One thing to know about Braille is that uncontracted Braille spells out every letter with its own cell. That obviously is clear, but it takes up a lot more space. Contracted Braille uses a single cell of Braille to represent multiple letters, such as common words or combinations, things like and or the or ing. This saves space. One key benefit of Braille is that people can produce it for themselves using a very simple, inexpensive, and portable device called a Braille slate. That, like I mentioned, wasn't impossible with embossed type books. And of course, now we have modern technology like Braillers, Braille embossers, and refreshable Braille displays and note-taking devices that let people produce Braille on their own on the fly. Even Braille wasn't historically simple. So whenever I talk about Helen Keller in particular, I talk about how she knew a number of languages, but also about how she knew 5 or 6 different ways to read with her fingers. Up until about 1920s, we hadn't settled on a single standard for Braille, either in the US or the UK. And there are all of these different innovative systems floating around that are not the same. Modern Braille, like Louis Braille's original, uses 2 columns of 3 rows of dots for 6 dots total. But New York Point, which is seen in the upper left, arranges the cells horizontally with 2 rows and up to 6 columns. American Braille, which was developed by a teacher at Perkins named Joel W. Smith, uses 2 columns and 3 rows, yay. But the cells are assigned so that the letters that get used the most frequently require the fewest dots. This makes it faster to write, but also very confusing if you don't know what form of Braille you're trying to read. And the bottom right image shows a different form of writing for the blind. This is called moon type, and it was widely used into the 20th century. It uses symbols similar to alphabet shapes, and for that reason was easier for older adults who had been sighted to learn. It's also interesting because you read the first line left to right and then follow a guideline down to follow read the next line right to left. It's meant to be easier to keep your place on the page. One of the things I love about this field is the innovation and willingness to experiment, but it's also often very confusing. Anne Sullivan, for the record, disliked reading Braille. Helen Keller used it widely, and she was very familiar with the different systems in use during her childhood and her early adulthood. Of course, text isn't the only thing we want to learn. I'm picking on some maps here, both because we have a really amazing collection of tactile maps, but also because geography was Anne's least favorite subject. So, but it's also one we have great photos of, so you're getting some geography. This is an example of a tactile map of the Gulf of Mexico and Louisiana. You can see that the labels are done in embossed type, but the rivers and other features of the landscape are laid out in tactile markings that you can follow with your finger. The most amazing example of a tactile map that we have is a gem of our collection, the Perkins Globe. It was created in 1837 by Stephen P. Ruggles and was used actively up until the 1940s. It has been touched by every famous person and a great many not so famous ones who have visited Perkins. I discovered this week that that included Oscar Wilde, so that was a new one to me. The globe is painted in different colors, with some sections having been repainted 10 times. It also has some really interesting quirks. So the Rocky Mountains run the wrong way at one point, and Antarctica isn't even represented. In both cases, that's because neither had been fully mapped when it was created. So this is an example of tools, and I'm going to pick up one of my other favorite photos, which has to do with taxidermy. One particular challenge for many children who are blind is to get a sense of scale. And so from the very early days of the school, the school built up this tactile museum that has models of everything from anatomy to famous buildings to cultural items from different communities. And part of that is a series of taxidermied animals. We have a swan in that collection, so I have now touched a swan. It's lovely. They're very soft. The collection here is from South America. The animals were usually acquired after the animal's death, often from zoos. and were specially prepared to be chemically safe to touch. The standard taxidermy chemicals aren't skin friendly. So this is just an example of, we have a whole museum of these things. And if you look at some photos from this period, you can see glassed-in cases in some of the library shots where there are just these figures sort of looming out from the glass at you. Academic subjects weren't the only thing on the schedule. As I mentioned, both boys and girls learned a variety of skills to help them learn to live independently as adults. These included things like sewing, basket weaving, mattress making, and chair caning that could potentially provide an income. But the real goal was to help students learn manual dexterity and to handle the placement of tools with the goal of it being easier to participate in household life. A lot of these skills transfer to academic work or to cooking or to managing your own clothing. Sewing was also not Anne's favorite. Henny quotes her talking about teaching Helen, saying, "Sewing and crocheting are the inventions of the devil, I think. I would rather break stones on the King's Highway than hem a handkerchief." But it's also very interesting that she taught Helen, despite it not being a favorite of hers. So what was it like for Anne when she came to Perkins? It was a very rough transition. She had very little common ground in interest or experience of the world. She had been living in this very rough environment with a lot of people dealing with mental illness or addiction or being very close to death. It was, as Liz mentioned, a very loud Irish Catholic, very emotional environment. And most of the girls she was in school with and many of the boys were from well-off Protestant families where they had been taught to behave themselves and keep quiet and keep out of the way. Anne was also in very beginning classes. This was the first time she'd come to school with much younger children, and she found that tremendously humiliating. She was certain that her teachers did not like her, and she did not like her teachers, but they made sure that, despite the fact that she was very different from most students they had taught, they made sure that she had appropriate clothing, that she got free tickets for musical programs in Boston. Part of the reason that the school stayed in Boston as long as it did was to go to things, to go to concerts and to museums and plays and other activities. There were two teachers she was originally very close to, Cora Newton, who I'll come back to in a minute, and Mary Moore. Mary Moore taught English, and Anne says, "She saw through the complexity of my experience and realized that one side of my mind was as undeveloped as a little child's, while the other was extraordinarily mature, that my intellect was eager and elementally sound, but warped by an undisciplined imagination." Anne particularly lived for Mary Moore's weekly hour-long Shakespeare classes. The other person that Anne became very close to arrived at Perkins in 1833. Her name was Sophie Hopkins. She was a widow whose sea captain husband had died on their first voyage after their marriage, and her daughter, who would have been Anne's age, had died around the time Anne came to Perkins. Once she came to Perkins as a house mother in one of the cottages, she kept her home on Cape Cod, but Anne spent holidays with her there after that point, as well as writing to her throughout their lives. This is a photo of her right around the time that this is going on. There were vision changes. So again, as Liz mentioned, Anne did finally have a successful operation to improve her eyesight. This is thanks to Dr. Bradford, who met her during her first summer in 1881, who was a young doctor at Massachusetts Eye and Ear. She had 2 operations a year apart that did in fact improve her vision. And by the second one, she could read print, although her vision, her focus acuity remained cloudy. So she could see objects, but it was exhausting to read print. And her vision remained very unreliable throughout her life. There were several times in her adult life where she goes on holiday to restore her vision a bit, or because of other illness. So now she can read print. What is she reading? Nella talks about some of the titles that Anne remembers reading. And so I wanted to mention these just because it gives you a sense of what was in vogue and what was available in embossed type or Braille in some cases. This includes East Lynne, an 1861 sensation novel by Mrs. Henry Wood, Silas Marner, 1861 novel by George Eliot, The Vicar of Wakefield, a 1766 novel by Anglo-Irish author Oliver Goldsmith, Quentin Durward, the 1823 book by Sir Walter Scott, The Last Days of Pompeii, an 1834 novel by Edward Bulwer Lytton, and then 2 that have particular Perkins connections. Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter was published in 1850, not too long after Sophia Peabody, who was by then his wife, had sculpted a bust of Laura Bridgman when Laura was 12, that is still in our museum, and it's a lovely piece of sculpture work. And then Charles Dickens visited Perkins on his United States tour in 1842. He mostly hated the US, but he loved Perkins and particularly really loved meeting Laura Bridgman. He wrote about her in his American Notes and later donated the funds to for the embossing of the old Curiosity Shop. There were also magazines, The Atlantic, Scribner's, a variety of religious papers, although not the Pilot, the widely read Catholic paper. And one of Anne's frustrations was that the newspapers read aloud, focused on appropriate subjects. So she had been used to getting the boxing news, and they would not read the boxing news, and they would not read the latest about the Tewksbury hearings as those happened. The other one I want to mention here is Youth's Companion, which was a juvenile magazine. And it was edited not too much later than this by Ed Chamberlain, who was a journalist and editor who was both a great supporter of both Anne and Helen a little later in Anne's life. The first letter we know about between them is 1892, but they clearly met before that. There's a fabulous, quite new biography of Ed by his great-great-great-granddaughter called Letters from Red Farm. Her name is Elizabeth Emerson, that talks about their history and highlights a lot of what Ed was up to. So he's also very interesting. I mentioned that Anne and Laura knew each other. By the time that Anne arrives at Perkins, Laura was a sewing teacher and seamstress. She shared a cottage with Anne during some of Anne's education. Laura actually moved cottages every year because she loved to talk to everyone so much. And the problem with tactile sign is you can't do anything else while you're talking because your hands are busy and you have to be physically close to the person you're talking to, which is great on one hand, but makes it harder to do, household chores or your homework. So the Laura would just move rooms into different cottages every year. But we know that this is how she learned the manual tactile alphabet and became fluent in it. Neller's comments about Anne telling her about this. Laura and Anne were not conscious of any great difficulty as they sat together, Annie spelling into the older woman's hand the gossip of the girls and the news of the day while Laura spelled into the air. I mentioned that Anne's self-advocacy is one of my favorite stories. And there were a series of ongoing hearings about the state of the Tewksbury Asylum, and Anne found out about these and she really wanted to go to them. She wanted to hear especially about news of the people she knew there, just any tidbit, because many of them were illiterate. She didn't have a lot of access to being able to write things in a form that other people could read. And she just wanted to know what these people who she had known very well and who had cared for her had been up to. She was forbidden to go and went anyway. She snuck out with a fellow student. And when she came back to school, they almost expelled her. There was a huge meeting of teachers. Several of her teachers, including people she hadn't expected it from, advocated for her. And also her teachers made the very real observation that if they expelled her, she was going to go right back there. And that was a particular kind of hypocrisy that maybe they could avoid. So they agreed to let her stay on. This also fits with a lot of Cora Newton's description of her. There's a point in Henny's biography where she clearly wrote to a number of people, and Cora writes back saying that Anne was a wholesome, vigorously active, impulsive, self-assertive, generally happy girl, inclined to be impatient and combative towards criticism or any opinion not in agreement with her own. And she evidenced much executive ability and initiative. And I love that quote because it shows you so much of Anne as an adult as well. Cora goes on to describe Anne's love of beautiful clothing and describes an evening that made it into the Miracle Worker script originally, where Anne asks if she can make a figure in the snow in a recent snowstorm. So they're in South Boston, there's a sort of courtyard, and three of her teachers watch from the schoolroom to make sure that she isn't disturbed, since they're sort of not too far from a main street. And they watch as Anne creates a figure out of snow that is full size, dressed in a low neck, short sleeved, long train evening gown with her hair arranged in heavy coils on her head, a long curl over her shoulder, sort of the height of fashion at this point. And the teachers were all, Henny says, deeply impressed with her skillful work and artistic expression. I'm impressed by her ability to do this in snow. So, and to wrap up, when Anne graduated in 1886, she did so as the class valedictorian. Her speech for the day is on the Perkins website, perkins.org/valedictory-address, or email me. My email will be on the next slide, and I'll send you the link. Her speech focuses on the need to go out into the wider world, and as Anne begins, do our little to make that world better, wiser, and happier. Close to the end, she says, fellow graduates, duty bids us go forth into active life. Let us go cheerfully, hopefully, and earnestly, and set ourselves to find our special part. And I will leave my slide up with Perkins website. My colleagues in the archives do a fantastic job with our Instagram. Check there for lovely photos and interesting historical tidbits on a regular basis. And if you have any questions for me, you can reach me at jennifer.arnott@perkins.org. Leave that up for just a second.
Great. Jennifer, thank you so much. Wonderful job as expected. Just phenomenal. B in the chat writes, wonderful presentation. I learned so much. Thank you. So folks, at this time, we have still about 10 or 15 minutes. If folks have any questions or comments, please get them into the chat in the Q&A, and Liz and Jennifer will stick with us. So an anonymous attendee asks, is there any information on Anne's marriage and her husband?
Yes, and I was not covering it in this talk because we were focusing on Anne's time at Perkins. Kim Nielsen is, I believe, talking tomorrow and is covering Anne's adult life. So I would recommend you, Kim's book, Beyond a Miracle Worker, is my favorite bio of the two of them, and the one I always recommend people start with. So I would recommend that. She goes into both Anne's and Helen's relationships in sufficient detail. But you can also email me, and I would be glad to point you at additional sources.
No, good answer, Jennifer. Thanks for the plug. Yeah, Kim is like the definitive biographer of Anne Sullivan. So she'll be with us tomorrow night, Wednesday, April 13th at 7 o'clock via Zoom. And information about that will be in the email I send you all tomorrow. Colleen asks, what days and hours are the Public Health Museum open? So that one's for you, Liz. And Liz, yep, go ahead.
Yes, the Public Health Museum is open for tours on Thursdays and outdoor tours on Saturday, and you would make reservations on our website.
All right, and is that publichealthmuseum.org or?
Correct.
Okay, excellent. I'll include that information in the email tomorrow as well. Thank you, Paige. So Paige in the chat, who's another super volunteer over at the Health Museum on the board, she included the URL in the chat. Paige says, thank you, awesome, and we look forward to sharing this with our Public Health Museum audience. That's wonderful. Colette says, kudos, and Colette is someone we're going to see on Thursday night. She is an actress and an author and historical performer who will be portraying Anne Sullivan. That's Thursday night, April 14th at 7 o'clock. Rick asks, so let's get back to the actual questions here. Rick asks, where is Perkins located in Boston? You want to take that one, Jennifer?
Yes, thank you for holding that long enough for me to pull up the fact that we keep privately that has this information. So it was East Broadway and South Boston between G and H streets, eventually expanding down to 5th Street. Again, email me and I can send you, somebody familiar with South Boston history did a lovely blog about the destruction of the old buildings that were there, and includes historical maps of the immediate area. But basically it's that 2-block area. It's now a municipal courthouse, is on part of the original property, roughly sort of where the hotel was, which is 535 East Broadway, South Boston. Excellent. And then again,
and that's where the school was, not is.
That's where the school was. Yeah.
Was, yes. And where's the school now, Jennifer?
We are now in Watertown, right on the Charles River. And we have been there since 1912. The campus was built for the school. So
great. So last call for questions and comments, folks. Otherwise, we're going to wrap a little early. While we're doing this, Jen, do you have any last words for the audience before we wrap up for the evening?
This was absolutely delightful, and it gave me a chance to focus on a bit of Anne's history we don't get to talk about as much. So I'm very excited.
And as I do that, we have another question. How many students are currently enrolled at Perkins?
We have about 180 students currently enrolled on campus in some form. I want to say 40 of those are residential right now, and the rest are day students. Perkins also, our marketing department would like me to say that we are not just a school. We are actually an institutional organization at this point. Perkins International works in 90-something countries around the world. Perkins Access provides a lot of support for making websites and other materials more accessible. The Perkins Library, which is not my library, I'm in the Research Library, is the National Library Services for the Blind and Print Disabled Library for Massachusetts. They are fabulous. If you know people who have vision problems or have trouble holding books. It also applies to physical disabilities or dyslexia. They would be delighted to get you in touch with services. And again, you can email me and I'll forward you to the right place. In terms of schools, most kids who are blind or visually impaired these days, even many students who are deafblind, are now in their public schools in mainstream education. But Perkins is also the sort of host employer for a lot of itinerant teachers who work in schools in New England. So we reach a lot of places in a variety of ways.
Wonderful organization. We have a repository collection. That's probably not the right word, but we have, I think around 30 or so talking books that we host here at our library that we, I think on a quarterly basis refresh from Perkins. So we thank you for that. And did I hear that you work at the Hayes Library, Jennifer?
Yes.
That
Yes.
has a nice ring to it. I like that name.
So
Mary Ann,
Timothy Hayes, who was a longtime researcher and psychologist at Perkins.
well, there we go. Mary Ann says, very interesting presentation. Thank you, she says. Repository, that's the word I think I was looking for. Yeah. Liz, did you have any last words for the group before we wrap up for the evening?
Well, just thank you for coming and logging in. And just a plug for the Public Health Museum to come on by and see where she lived, and as well as the history of public health.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Liz. Georgia says thank you, very informative. I agree. So folks, look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to the feedback survey, a link to this recording, information about Wednesday and Thursday's virtual programs if you're not already signed up. And I'll also have some general information about the Public Health Museum and about Perkins. Susan says thank you. Catherine says I learned a great deal. Thank you to the panelists for pulling all this together. All right, we'll end it there. Thank you all so much. Hope to see you Wednesday and Thursday. Everyone enjoy this wonderful weather and have a great night. Bye-bye.